Welcome to Conversatio, the Belmont Abbey College podcast. This podcast is to form and transform our community so that each of us can reflect God's image. Remember Genesis 1:26, right? And then my name is Father Matthew Schneider. I am a visiting assistant professor of theology here at the Abbey, and I'll be the host for this episode. Today I'm joined by Dr. Shane Gomes, who is an assistant professor and the chair of psychology at Belmont Abbey College, as well as Dr. Richard Dell'Isola, assistant professor of psychology at Belmont Abbey College. We're excited to talk to our guests about Catholic psychology. But before we begin, let's have these two guests introduce themselves. Shane, why don't you go first?
Well, like you said, I'm Dr. Shane Gomes. I'm the chair, and I'm an associate professor of psychology. I've been here at Belmont Abbey for 6 years now, and I teach, and I do some of the administrative work as well. I'm also a licensed clinical psychologist in the state of North Carolina, so I have a small private practice. I see patients as well on the part-time too, so I teach and see patients too.
Well, you probably want to keep yourself fresh a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. It's wonderful.
It's helpful, like in that kind of thing. Like I do bioethics, and it's good that I'm teaching the nursing students, but it's also good that every month I get somebody who sends me a consultation type thing of some situation that's not super obvious. What's the bioethical solution here and things? So, Dr. Dell'Isola.
Yeah, thank you. So my name is Dr. Richard Dell'Isola. Similar story to Shane's. So assistant professor in the psychology department at the Abbey. This is my third year at the Abbey. And so I teach classes like developmental psychology, abnormal psychology, and some others. And then I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist associate in the state of North Carolina. So I work for a private practice, a Catholic private practice called Transfiguration Counseling. And so I see about 8 to 10 clients a week there, some in person, some online. So I see couples, I do a lot of marital work, but also just individuals, anxiety, depression, OCD, scrupulosity, those sorts of things.
Excellent. Yeah. So I have a little bit of background here. Just before I came to Belmont Abbey, I was doing my doctoral thesis. While I was doing that as a priest, you usually have some kind of ministry. In my ministry, I was helping out at Divine Mercy University as an assistant chaplain. Divine Mercy University is they only do grad degrees. They're another Newman's college like Belmont Abbey, but they just do grad degrees only in psychology and counseling. So I think Dr. Gomes has told me before that it's one of the ones he recommends for Belmont Abbey grads. So it's kind of the continuation there. And I wasn't teaching or anything. I was more just the one who was saying mass multiple times a week for the staff and students and things. But you get talking to them, you get some idea of psychology from that. So let's begin with addressing the idea of how we live in a broken world. What does this mean from a Christian and Catholic perspective? How do we recognize the brokenness? How can psychology inform us on understanding of human suffering and things like that? Well, Dr. Dell'Isola, why don't you go first?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's definitely a big question. I'm kind of wrestling with where to start. And in thinking about this, I think the question is more about psychology in general, right? So we'll get to the Catholic and Christian perspective. But as far as psychology goes, if we think about human suffering, like let's maybe wade into the Catholic perspective. And if we just look at human suffering on the surface, you could make the case that suffering is at least partially, if not completely, psychological. And think about something like trauma, for example. So a trauma, like let's say you break your arm, okay? That's not really, unless it's a traumatic incident, it's not as traumatic as something that's happened to you, like being abused or neglected, right? So if we think about what psychology has to offer, well, so psychology says this is something like trauma or abuse is a psychological, it has a psychological etiology. And we have specific interventions that have been developed over time to address the psychology behind it, right? So if trauma is a psychological process, well, we heal through psychological interventions.
Oh, definitely. I think see like that difference. Like I remember as a kid, I broke my leg going sledding because I'm up from Canada. So, and it wasn't nearly as bad as, like other people who had similar injuries, but from like another person, not just I imprudently went over a jump while I was sledding. Dr. Gomes, do you have anything to add?
Just, I would also add that, we're made body and soul, right? So when we talk about suffering and trauma, we have to always remember that, we're an integrated whole. So you can't just treat the body. You also have to think about what the soul needs as well. So Dr. Dell'Isola and I know we incorporate a lot of integrative approaches to psychology in our treatment because we see the whole person. And so we might encourage them, to do the the psychological treatments or the medical treatments, maybe take medication or do this type of therapy or whatever. But then we'll also focus on your spiritual side as well, like encouraging them, if they're Catholic, to go back to the sacraments and to return to prayer and read scripture, because we see the importance of integrating both. And so I think it really depends on who you're working with. Suffering is sort of tailored to the client, right? If they come from a spiritual background, then we can incorporate that into the work that we do with them. It's obviously a lot more challenging when somebody comes from a background where religion is not a focus, or they don't see the soul, and so that makes it more challenging as well.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Yeah. Well, we had our next follow-up question. Richard kind of like touched on a little bit. We were talking about how psychology can address issues of trauma and things like that. Was really what we were going to get to next, right? Because we live in that broken world. How can we help people to cope with those kind of traumas, the mental health issues, struggles of daily life? Because I think there's a whole spectrum from like, I'm just struggling with, some daily life things, to like, I can't sleep because of this trauma. And I think psychology can help in different ways, different degrees to those different things. So do you want to start again?
Yeah. And I think just to piggyback on what Shane was saying, and I'll take a little from what Paul Vitz says in his Catholic Christian meta model of the person, that if you trace the history of psychology as we get closer and closer to present day, you get things that start sounding kind of Christian-y, but they're not. So for example, the positive psychologists are going to say, among other things, that we want to aim for a high degree of subjective well-being. And subjective well-being is defined along the lines of the extent to which you forgive, you're humble, and you're gracious. And that sounds really nice. And I always tell my students, I write those on the board, those 3 areas of subjective well-being. And I say, what does this sound like? And they say, well, scripture, especially like the New Testament. Like this sounds like, like the Sermon on the Mount maybe. And so then we talk about, well, how is this devoid of religion a challenge to healing? Like if we just look at this from a secular perspective, and one of the answers is that it's subjective. So for forgiveness, when do you forgive? When should you forgive? Do you have the right to not forgive? If so, when, right? From a secular perspective, how grateful ought you be for something? And what does humility mean in a secular sense? And so it's tough. I guess I'm not answering your question. I guess I'm starting with posing a challenge to healing, and that I think that's one of the ways that the secular view would fall short.
Oh yeah, definitely. I think you have sometimes where you have terms that are very similar, but mean very different things. Like I was thinking of, I taught a few weeks ago. If you talk about the material versus the formal sufficiency of Scripture, and the formal sufficiency of Scripture is a sola scriptura version, a Protestant version, whereas the material sufficiency that every doctrine is, explicitly or implicitly in Scripture is the Catholic is never been dogmatically defined, but it's the commonly held Catholic view. So, do you have anything to add, Dr. Gomes?
Yeah, I think Dr. Dell'Isola was pointing out the key aspect of trauma treatment is the forgiveness phase, right? And so, especially if your trauma is due to some perpetrator who, violated you. I've taught classes on, violence and child abuse, and at one point you have to forgive your perpetrator, and I think this is where Christianity has the upper hand, because we understand forgiveness, because we're all forgiven in Christ, right? So that's an area where I think the secular types of approaches fall short, because they don't really understand the depth of forgiveness and the power and the importance of forgiveness, especially when it comes to healing from trauma and hurts and sufferings.
It's kind of like an empty version of forgiveness.
Correct.
In that sense, like it's, you're forgiven, but it's meaningless, and it's not. It's, and things like that. So I think we're going to go back to Dr. Gomes first, because we asked Dr. Isola first the last 2 times. But how can a psychologist with a moral Christian, Judeo-Christian or Judeo-Christian Catholic worldview seek principles in their practice? What kind of benefits can this integration provide for those offering therapy? And I think, specifically in this, Dr. Isola mentioned the book by Dr. Paul Vitz, and I think it has several other authors, the Catholic Christian Meta Model of the Person, which has really been a big thing in Catholic psychology in the last few years. I knew about it because when it came out, I was still chaplain at Divine Mercy, which is where Dr. Paul Vitz taught. I think he just retired. So that goes. I have some background in that, but I have not read it cover to cover. It's it's one of these books that's, like 500 pages or something. It looks like a brick.
Yeah.
It looks like a brick, but it's very valuable still, I think, for psychologists. You want to comment on
Yeah,
this?
actually, I mean, I teach a course on integration of psychology with theology, philosophy, and biology, and I have my students actually read the first chapter out of the Catholic Christian meta model of the human person, and so they look at the introductory aspects of it. Like you said, it's a big book, but an excellent book, but it lays the foundation of sort of what I mentioned earlier, which was we are made body and soul, and so the authors, Dr. Paul Vitz, Dr. Craig Titus, and Dr. William Nordling, and the others, they all laid a sort of a foundation of the human person as, again, body and soul. And so respecting all aspects of the body and all aspects of the soul. And so I think that's the model where all mental health professionals should start from, is respecting both, the physical and as well as the spiritual.
Yeah. Now, how would you distinguish kind of the psyche is understood from modern psychology and the soul is understood from Christian theology? Because, the word psyche itself comes from the Greek word, the same word that was used in Greek for soul. So how would you distinguish that kind of psychological element from our kind of spiritual soul?
This is a tough question, right? So, but I think because, the Catechism talks about the soul as sort of the life of the body, right? And so, can we separate our mind from our soul? It's a tough question because psychology tries to just focus on the physical, the body part, but at the same time we have a soul. And so when you talk about the psyche, are you talking the mind or are we talking the body or the soul? And that's a tough question.
Oh, that is a tough question. I mean, I know in theological anthropology how you distinguish, different, or philosophical anthropology, which actions are using your brain and which actions are using your non-physical mind. That's really a whole challenge. And psychology mainly focuses on the brain in that sense, but the brain is is in a way more is intimately connected with our mind,
Correct.
Our spiritual aspect. Mm-hmm. So, did you have anything to add about this idea of how this Catholic Christian worldview can influence psychology and things?
Sure. Yeah, and so I don't teach the integration class, but what I start with most of my classes where it's applicable is before we talk about any of the chapters of the textbook or anything like that, we do about 1 or 2 lectures, like a crash course in the Catholic Christian meta model of the person. And I try to pick the things out that will be most applicable for that specific course. One of the things we do, and we always, typically in class, we have really good conversations, and the students get really interested in it. And what I will say too, and if anyone's listening that's not Catholic or even not Christian, this is how I talk to my students, and this might be applicable for any listeners. I would say, if you're Catholic, what I'm about to tell you, you're just going to be saying, amen, this is great, this is awesome, usually, probably. If you're non-Catholic Christian, so some sort of evangelical, non-denominational, most of this is going to sound really good to you. If you are maybe agnostic, atheist, or of some other faith, you might be pushing up against, like you might find a lot of places where this is butting heads with your worldview, and I just ask you to wrestle with it. And in some parts of the CCMMP are, I think, very accessible to people even if they're not of the faith. So I'll give you an example. According to the philosophical psychology of the model, humans are 4 things primarily. So bodily, interpersonally relational, intelligent, and volitional.
Mm-hmm.
And so I tell the students, I cover up the word Christian and Catholic on the board, and I say, would anyone argue with the fact that we are these 4 things? And everyone's like, well, no, obviously we would agree that we ought to have free will, that we ought to use our reason, that we are meant for connection, and then we have bodies, right? So it's very accessible. And a lot of students ask, well, if you're Catholic and you work for a Catholic practice, how are you going to work with someone who's not Catholic? And I say, well, we all believe this about all people. This comes from the rich philosophical tradition of the church, right? This is not something that a lot of people, or this is 2,000 years of history that and philosophizing. And then the theological psychology is that all humans are created in the image and likeness of God, that we're all fallen, but we're all redeemed by the blood of Christ. And that's where they're like, well, how do you do that with someone who's not Catholic? Mm-hmm. Right? And you can't, of course, evangelize in the therapy room unless someone is asking questions about it. But I just, start by saying, like, well, imagine if we viewed all people like this, Like imagine if the client sitting in front of you had a radically different worldview. You're a devout Catholic and that person sitting in front of you is, let's say, a passionate atheist, but you still view that person as being redeemed by the blood of Christ. Like we're probably going to be more likely to love that client well.
Oh yeah, and I think even just things like the fact that you have the idea that it's the spiritual reality, not just the pure physical understanding. Even like I went to psychology once, and I ended up with a good psychologist who was Jewish, and obviously they wouldn't agree that we were redeemed by the blood of Christ. They would agree with a lot of the other things in general, but they were very helpful, and they understood the spiritual aspect of life as well. So going on to the next question, we kind of have to look at what's the significance of having a psychologist who adheres to like a moral framework, from Christianity, Catholicism, we get a moral framework. I could go into this way in depth. I teach the bioethics class here. So how can such a framework guide the therapeutic process, the ethical decision making, and the pursuit of healing and well-being? And what would be the negative effects, the opposite, if you have a psychologist who doesn't have a moral framework or doesn't even have kind of a spiritual framework, who's just kind of a materialist or things like that. So I don't know. Let's go with Dr. Gomes first.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you lack a moral framework, then your whole approach to healing is different. And I mean, I'll give you an example of a friend from college. He went to a psychologist that didn't have a moral framework. And so my friend at the time was single and depressed, and I encouraged him to go to see a psychologist. And so he goes to one of these psychologists that doesn't have a moral framework. And basically what the psychologist told him was, to get over your depression, you need to go out and find women and sleep with them. That's what the psychologist told him to do. Like, this will help you overcome your depression. And that's clearly an approach with no moral foundation, And so you can get guidance from people who have no moral compass and be directed in the wrong areas.
That one wouldn't even seem to agree with, at least from what I understand from peer-reviewed research.
Correct. Yeah.
Even independent of is it morally right? It doesn't seem to correspond to that.
And so you're getting advice from people with no moral framework. Then I think that's a shame, because it's going against our nature, to go against sin, Yeah. And so I think, I don't know about Dr. Dell'Isola, but I get a lot of requests from Christians and Catholics because they want somebody who has a psychologist who has a moral perspective, has similar faith. Especially what's happening now in the field of psychology, where we're seeing all these deviations in sexuality and gender, and so people are seeking somebody who's like-minded with their morals.
Yeah.
Their daughter or their son is questioning their sexual orientation or their gender. They want somebody who's going to guide them in a healing, helpful way, not in something immoral or to act out on these, sexual, thoughts that they're having or whatever. So I get quite a few requests from parents and people who want somebody who has their shared, not only their shared religious beliefs, but their shared moral beliefs about especially about sexuality in the family.
I've had a lot of similar experiences. Clients coming saying, I had a bad experience with this therapist who didn't share the same moral framework, and I get that. Also, I do a lot of couples, marital work, and I get a lot of couples saying, so-and-so therapist basically was pushing us toward divorce, right? And we don't want a therapist that's going to push us into a quick divorce, something like that. And I was like, well, amen. Let's dig in, and I think this goes back to the idea of the difference between, and this would come out of Thomistic psychology, which I know Vitz pulls from, and others. The way we might describe secular psychology is it's what a man does, what are his actions. And they would go even if you think of the behaviorists, some of the behaviorists who have had the biggest impact on the field of psychology, like John B. Watson, he's basically, I'm paraphrasing him, but he basically said, what we can do in psychology is analyze and observe human behavior, figure out how to train them, and then control behavior, right? So again, what a man does. And so the Catholic approach is going to be, of course it's important what we do, that goes without saying, but it's first and foremost about who we are. Who is a man?
Oh, definitely.
What is he made for?
Well, definitely, and I would think that the marriage and family, the marriage issue would be one of the biggest ones, because I know especially specifically a Catholic psychologist, because I've heard numerous cases where people go in and like, oh, you look incompatible. The easiest solution to that is just get divorced, right? And not even putting in, a kind of, a base level, let alone a strong effort to save the marriage, and just kind of think, okay, what's the quickest, easiest solution? And I don't know if you want to if either you want to comment on that, because I do think that particularly in marriage is going to be marriage counseling, when you're kind of having a struggle in your marriage, is somewhere where a question like this, like the moral framework of the psychologist, would matter the most.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where really the religious beliefs of the couple is so imperative, that whenever I work with couples, I want to know what is your understanding of marriage? What is your definition of marriage? And if I get a Catholic couple, which I've gotten several of, they'll say it's a sacrament and it's indissoluble and it's faithful and it's for life, and so there is no such thing as a Catholic divorce, and so, I'll concur with that. And so then we'll work from a perspective of, okay, since you're stuck with each other forever, how can we work through these differences? And of course I don't say it like that, but it's a matter of working through the challenges that the couple is facing, knowing that divorce is not an option. I mean, I've had to tell a couple once, your marriage is valid. It was in the church, sacramental. Your marriage is forever. Divorce isn't an option for you, and so that immediately made them think, okay, now I have to really work on this relationship. There's no out.
Yeah.
I can't just leave anymore. Yeah. And all these temptations to just leave the relationship, it has a new, deeper meaning, Yeah. And so I found that to be very helpful for working with couples too, is looking at the foundation of their marriage, and if it's a sacrament, how are we going to work through this together,
Oh yeah, and even there, I think I read a study a bit ago. I don't remember. You might know the citation particularly, but it's basically that they followed up with couples who were kind of on the verge of a divorce, mm-hmm. and then they looked at them 5-10 years later, and the ones who stayed together were actually happier than the ones who broke up, mm-hmm. even though you would think, even though at like the 6-month mark, the ones who broke up were like, oh, now I'm done with this. But it was kind of like on the long-term, that long-term happiness was actually staying together, when it's something of like, we just disagree on this thing, and we have these arguments about, pointless things or whatever else in the marriage. Mm-hmm. Obviously, if there's like abuse and things like that, get out. But we're talking about, differences in mm-hmm. between the couples where they're kind of arguing or disagreeing and things.
Mm-hmm. And then the impact if they have children, the impact on the children is huge. I mean, divorce has so many, there's tons of research showing the negative effects of divorce on children and their well-being and their psychological well-being. And so that makes a big difference too if there's children involved.
Oh yeah, no, definitely. They're the ones, what was it like? There's been several studies on that I've read. I read a book-length study on that one time, and it's like, unless the kids saw abuse or were abused, almost every single one of them is like, I wish my parents stayed together. Mm-hmm. And so, but what kind of challenges might you have with seeking a Catholic psychologist, both in kind of how hard it is to seek it, and then there's also the objection of like, okay, well, if they're Catholic, they lack a certain objectivity. That would be the objection, obviously. Mm-hmm. And how would you respond to an objection like that? I don't know, Dr. Gomes, you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, again, I go back to what Dr. Dell'Isola mentioned earlier, that we see the whole person, right? And so we try to help the person, even if our religious beliefs are different. And I've worked with people from all religious backgrounds, and we work toward healing. That's what they come for. And so we treat them with respect and love and dignity. And so we would help them regardless. And so to claim that because I advertise as Catholic, I'm not being as objective. The same could be argued if you don't advertise. If you're not, then you're not being objective because you don't have a certain framework in terms of how you look at the human person too. So our approach is the way Christ would approach people, is with love, and with all people.
Yeah, this is kind of, there's kind of like there's kind of two approaches. One is that like actually the Catholic Church has the objective truth, and the other one is like the postmodern kind of, there is no objectivity, and like everyone who says they're objective or who says they have like some kind of, has no philosophy. They actually have a philosophy, and they just tend to have a worse philosophy than somebody who's aware of what their philosophy or religious background is. So did you have anything to add?
Yeah, and I would I think Dr. Gomes, there's a lot of important information covered there, and what I would just add is, so just a short background on myself is that I'm a revert to the faith. So I'm a cradle Catholic, but I wasn't always practicing, and at one point I was out of the church, and so I know what it's like to be in the chair of the client who's iffy about the faith, for sure. And I know from that chair, I know that I would have been kind of hesitant or tentative to hear anything about the faith, or for someone to come on too strongly about it. But one of the things that brought me back to the faith, I think, through by the grace of God, was like people being patient with me and loving me well, like just working with me at my pace. Not sugarcoating it, right? Like we're always telling the truth, but also just being really patient and gentle and loving. And so that's really important. And I think it's super true that when we say that we're not being objective, well, part of the reason I love working for a Catholic practice is because I'm upfront being honest with my clients, so they know exactly who I am. And that's a key part of the psychotherapy process to me, is like there's no unnecessary secrets. Like I want them to know what I believe, more or less, right? Just so they're not caught off guard by anything.
Oh yeah, definitely. That's always one of the things. Like I mentioned, I went to a Jewish psychologist, and that was not mentioned the first thing, but then like their degrees were all like Hebrew University, and they had like multiple degrees, and they're all Jewish universities. And I'm like, okay, very high chance. And then one time we ended up talking about the Psalms, and I was like, okay, yes, they're definitely at least familiar with the Psalms and things like that. So they were, I never actually asked them, but that kind of openness and direct things with that. So now. Moving on, what about the holistic approach to Catholic or Christian psychology, right? Which considers spiritual, emotional, and psychological well-being. How can that help somebody, in more of the kind of day-to-day struggles that you might go to a psychologist with, maybe not the marriage issues, but like, somebody who's just, I feel a little depressed, I'm not, I'm feeling down, whatever else like that. So you want to go first?
Sure. There's a lot of benefits, and I think the benefit, and this is something that not to go back to the meta model, but one of the benefits they note there is that there is a clear moral framework, right? And the ethics, everything's on the like clear and explicit, right? Like the explicit theology, and so one good thing to check in on with clients is things like their prayer life. Are they living a sacramental life? And doing kind of like a spiritual check-in, and not from a place of superiority. It's not that at all, right? The second theological principle here is that we're all fallen. Yeah. So it's not like, well, I'm doing everything perfectly, are you? It's, let's just have Catholic to Catholic here, like let's discuss how things are going. And this is a good place where you can be open and honest, right? And it's confidential. It's not confession, right? But it's it's a really important place to get to talk about those things. And then I think also, thinking about going back to Dr. Gomes' emphasis on we have a body, right? And are you treating your body well? So I know this sounds super simple, but are you eating? Are you sleeping? Like how are you treating your body in those most basic ways that through, of course, the church and also natural law shows us like these are important things to invest in, right? Yeah.
No, I know if I don't sleep well, like 2 nights in a row, the next day I'll just feel really bad. Like, like not the great depression where but I'm like, I feel really horrible today. I'm like, oh, wait a second. I slept like 4 hours last night and 5 hours the night before. I wonder why.
Yeah, and sleep deprivation is a form of torture, right? So, like,
exactly.
So,
So, I'm usually pretty good about getting, 7.5 hours of sleep, but not always. Anyway, so what would you add to this idea of the holistic practice?
If you look at the research, there's a ton of research on religiosity and mental well-being. And you're going to see in the research that people who practice a faith, emotionally, they're just better off than people who don't, And with regard to trauma, people who practice some sort of religion get through the trauma better than people who don't practice a religion. Like there's some basic research like that. People who have a religion are less likely to develop post-traumatic stress disorder, even though they were in a trauma, than people who don't have a practice of religion. They're more likely to develop post-traumatic stress disorder. So your faith gives you a lot of coping skills. And so I think part of healing the holistic person is to incorporate, like I said earlier, like incorporate that religious aspect. I'll give you an example. I work with a lot of men who struggle with pornography addiction, okay? And some are Catholic, some aren't. But the ones that are, in working through the guilt and the shame of falling into this addiction, sometimes I'll say, when's the last time you went to confession? And, someone will say it's been months. And so I might encourage them to go to the sacraments. And it's interesting because those that do go, they come back with this different sense of like, yeah, this is a challenge, this is a struggle, but I'm not a bad person anymore because Jesus forgives me. He forgave me, in the confessional. And so it makes my job easier when they practice their Catholic faith
definitely.
with the sacraments, because then we're able to help them with the addictive nature and the psychological ramifications of that addiction. And so the religious aspect is so key to healing. And again, back to the forgiveness piece too.
Well, yeah, and I think that goes both ways, because I know in a confessional, you're also like, if this person is coming back repeatedly with pornography or something like that, it's like, well, start like, maybe get an accountability partner with something like Covenant Eyes, or go to a psychologist or something like that to get that kind of help that is beyond the confessional, because we are body, soul, and spirit together, and they have to work together. It's not just, hey, I keep coming to confession every 2 weeks and confess the same sins, and I just try and tough it out, like, white knuckle it. No, you put in the other means, like getting to try and deal with whatever issue it is.
I want to add too, if you don't mind, that like that idea of so going back to trauma, because we're talking about often, and I tell my students, I'm sure you do the same, if you want to be a clinician one day, you just have to be prepared that you're going to hear about the worst parts of people's lives all day when you do that, right? And of course, trauma and abuse, those are some of the hardest things to hear about. And so for the clinician who's coming from a Catholic perspective, certainly for the client, if they have a faith background, like maybe if as a thought experiment, if everyone could think, like, if you did not have your faith, how could you ever make sense of being abused? Not that it's easy to make sense of it anyway. I'm not going to claim it's ever going to be like super easy to make sense of it, but without faith, where do you? And so the Catechism says, and I'm going to paraphrase the Catechism, something like, and so it's not trauma specific, it's more about psychological illness and disorder. But the Catechism says that without our understanding of human brokenness and original sin, that we have to chalk up all of these awful things that happen to just basically random chance, random psychological flaws in people. That's not really reassuring for me at all.
Yeah.
I don't find that to be one bit comforting. So it's not easy, but we see in the lives of the saints like Saint Maria Goretti and many others that they immediately were able to make meaning. It was not easy, of course, that's why they're saints, but they were able to find meaning and show love and forgiveness in those moments. And that's a missing element, right? It's much easier to have a conversation with someone when we're able to say, to look at Jesus on the cross and see his sacrifice and him suffering the ultimate pain. It's a prototype, right? It's the perfect example, and without that, I'd kind of be stuck on where to go.
Yeah. So we have one last question here. Let's start with Dr. Gomes here. How can these faith-based principles, the kind of moral principles, help with resiliency to move forward? How can they help somebody to really have that resiliency ability to move forward with psychology?
The more you practice your faith, the stronger you are, right? So it's like muscles, right? The more you work your muscles, the stronger they become, right? Same with your faith. So the more you practice your faith. What I found over the years of being a psychologist is the more you practice your faith, the stronger your psyche becomes. You're better at dealing with difficulties and sufferings because you have a way of coping that's healthier. Of course, your prayer life is huge, right? How much you take your sufferings and your trials to the Lord in prayer. That's key, I think. Even the great mystic Saint Teresa of Avila will tell you, take all your emotions to the Lord, in prayer, whatever you're going through, your trials and your sufferings. And she'll teach in her autobiography about the importance of taking your emotions into prayer. Don't leave anything back, because Jesus can handle your emotions. Is what she'll talk about, And so I think that's key to healing, is to ultimately go to Christ in prayer and to surrender that over to Him. And it's a process. We're all working on this process.
Okay. Yeah, definitely. I think those are that's definitely a thing. Do you have anything to add, Dr. Dell'Isola?
Yeah, this probably become maybe it's a recency bias or something to that effect. But one thing I would add, just hopefully to make it really practical, is to not be captive to our day and age, to modernism, basically. And so, technology, cell phones, all these things, all the trends that are here, a lot of them, of course, you can make the case that if you use the technology wisely, it's okay, But in general, I think we're all becoming captive to these dopamine hits, these quick hits of dopamine and what's right in front of us, and we forget what's also right in front of us, all around us and ever present, which is the everlasting God, right? So, not being afraid to be weird, to look weird in today's day and age. Like, stay weird, right? I've heard that said. Catholics, devout Catholics, stick out. And that's not a bad thing, right? The modern culture, even modern psychology, often will tell you, like, you shouldn't have to be in a monogamous relationship, right? You shouldn't have to live by, like do whatever you want, do what makes you happy. And that's really dangerous. We've always known that as Catholics. It's getting maybe harder to believe for this generation because of the proliferation of media and things like that, but stay weird.
I definitely see that. I'm listening to the Father Mike Schmidt's Catechism every year. I'm a little behind, a few weeks behind. And the one I listened to yesterday was talking about how Christian Smith, who's a sociologist, he's done several studies on young people, and one of the latest ones is on the moral lives. And for him, like 60% didn't even really have moral categories. It was like, it was sick or stupid, but it wasn't like morally right or wrong even. And that's the world we have to speak to, and that's the world that we have to bring the message to, I think. And that is a challenge to kind of distinguish those things, between, this is somebody who has a psychological problem and that caused him to do something, and this is somebody who made a wrong choice. I think that's a very important distinction to make.
And I think it helps that as Catholics we have histories of saints that have lived out the faith and who have struggled with similar kinds of things. And so, you mentioned Saint Maria Goretti, or there's the modern Saint Blessed Carlo Acutis, and a young boy. And sometimes I'll like the women that I work with that are in difficult marriages. Sometimes I'll encourage them to read the life of Saint Monica or Saint Rita, where they had these abusive husbands, but yet they stayed faithful. They took their husband to prayer, to the Lord. And that helps too, having, all these saints that we can look up to and follow, imitate their example. We forget how powerful their intercession is, but how much they can help us psychologically as well too. So
I think the power of sacrifice, and my wife and I were just talking about this recently, that, we talk, what constitutes good, solid mental health? I mean, that's a huge question. But my mind first might go to, how willing are you to sacrifice and be obedient to the will of God? Right. So, and this might sound silly, but the other night, our 4-month-old just stopped sleeping. She was sleeping really well, and she decided to stop sleeping. So we were on a roll. She was sleeping through the night, and then all of a sudden she stopped. And so my wife rolls over and says, "Hey, can you help? I've been up all night." And I am being really honest here. The first thing that went through my mind before I said anything was, "Really? Why? Don't you know how much this is going to cost me?" Like that's what went through my mind, is like, well, I'm going to get less sleep. Then I'm going to be more tired. I'm going to have a longer day at work. I'm going to have trouble lecturing, et cetera, right? I might not get to work out. Like, when you say that out loud, like, I guess I'm broadcasting how selfish I was. But like, in the moment, what my humanness was said, don't sacrifice. That's going to cost you too much.
We all have those. Right? We all have those temptations.
But the good mental health probably is something like, I would love to help you because Jesus died for me. Jesus died on the cross for me. I would jump into helping you, and I'm not going to count the cost, right?
Yeah, but it's also like there's a healthy way to say, okay, this is a temptation to not do the right thing, but I have the ability to do the right thing, and that's why I presume
that's overcoming our brokenness.
That's overcoming our brokenness. Yeah. Well, I think that idea of the saints, that idea of our own sacrifice for each other out of love, is a good place to end. So, just to conclude, thank you for joining us here for this Conversatio. Thank you to Dr. Shane Gomes and Dr. Richard Dell'Isola for taking time to join us in the wonderful conversation. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, Press the like button, tell your friends. Conversatio available on Spotify, Apple, Google Podcasts, etc. I know I use Podcast Addict, which isn't on here. So until next time, God bless you.